Next on Inside the SCCA, talking data acquisition. On this episode of Inside the SCCA, I catch up with a guy who had a long career in the top tier of motorsports after stumbling into a job that really didn't exist. Now he's using what he learned to help him go faster in the SCCA. My guest, Tim Wise. Hey, Tim.
Hey, Brian. Great to meet you.
Good to meet you. I've heard a lot about you from one of our mutual friends, Brian Schubert. Brian is a Spec Racer Ford guy out here in Southern California, and he said, "You got to get Tim on the show. He's a guy he knows a lot of stuff." And I'm like, "Well, I like people who know a lot of stuff. That helps me know more stuff." So I always like to start at the beginning, and so my standard opening question is, how did you get mixed up in this crazy thing of motorsports?
I mean, how far back in the beginning do you really want to go?
I go back to 16 years old, 1986, being a crew chief, in air quotes, for my dad's Formula V.
Okay.
So how far back do you go?
My brother basically was 15 years older than me. He lived at home going to college while I was 5 years old. And he had a very cool Datsun 510 before Datsun 510s were very cool.
Right.
And he took me basically to Riverside. He took me for a Cal Club event. He took me to the Long Beach Grand Prix Formula 5000 race.
Yep.
Still have the ticket stub.
Nice.
And he took me to the 1976 California 500 at Ontario Motor Speedway. And the third time was the charm, where it really got me hooked. I found it really interesting. I think he was working for Tube Sales at the time that we went to the California 500. And so they were vendors to many race teams, and so had credentials and got to go into the garage area, not into the pits, but into the garage area. And it was very intriguing for, someone young, and it was a great day, and spent it with my brother, and I got hooked.
Nice. So you were about how old at that point?
I was probably between 10 and 12 or so.
Okay. So between 10 and 12 and when you actually started working on cars, what was that? When did all that work out?
So probably in college, I had been hanging around Cal Club events while I was in high school. And then my first year in college, I actually met Matt Weiss, who was a Formula Ford driver, who had damaged the nose on his car, and he put a driver carries no cash decal on the replacement nose. And I took a picture of it, and it ended up appearing either in Sports Car or California Sports Car or something. And so he had found me a couple of races later and said, "Hey, how can I get a picture of that?" And met Matt, and then I met Bill Schubert, which is Brian's dad, and I crewed on that car for a while. And at the time, Matt was working for Electromotive, which was the Don Devendorf, John Knepp, IMSA GTO team at the time. They had just kicked off the GTP program. Before they were running it, they were basically designing the car, contracting with Lola and Wiseman for transaxles and so forth. And I asked him, I was like, "Hey, do you guys ever hire interns?" And I was in my freshman year of college and met with John Knepp, and basically his requirements were you needed to be able to breathe in order to come help. And so I spent a summer doing that. And that was really my first foray into professional racing. I was essentially, as Electromotive, we had access to Nissan Motor Company drawings that we were not able to release to Lola and so forth. And so my job was to basically take those drawings and obfuscate them to the point where Lola could get what they needed, but they couldn't actually see all the details that were related to the motor as designed by Nissan.
So is that the Nissan GTP program?
It was the V6 cast iron block before they switched to the very first car had a cast iron OEM V6 block.
So that was before the turbo.
I think it was turbocharged, but I believe they gave up on the iron block pretty quickly. But that was after I had left. I was there only for a summer.
Right. Was that the Jeff Brabham cars?
It was.
So the 83 GTP car is the car that made me fall in love with motorsports.
Really? Well,
But when that car would lay off the gas and you'd hear that wastegate go,
Yeah.
It's a sound I'll never get out of my head. That was like
Yeah.
my dream car.
Devendorf was light years ahead of
Yeah.
everybody in engine control back then. I mean, it was all very much electromechanical up until, it was actually the GTO car, I believe, where they really developed it, the EFI
Yeah.
capabilities, and then applied that to the GTP car as well.
That's so cool. So cool. All right. So what did you go to college for?
So I went for mechanical engineering
Okay.
and computer science. I was on the 6-year program. I did 2 6-month cooperative education stints. Once I left electromotive after I'd done that summer internship, I went to go work for Cal Wells's PPI, or Precision Preparation, which was the Toyota Motorsports factory off-road program in short track and desert racing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I really got my first foray into data acquisition. Cal was really well-funded and forward-thinking, always looking for an unfair advantage. And there was a system developed by Emerson Computer Power, which was kind of not a race car manufacturer. They were a large conglomerate, but they were a sponsor of True Sports back in the day, and they developed a small data logger for motorsports, specifically for the True Sports program or sponsorship program, part of their activation. And then they started selling it, and
Right.
Cal was very much on board to putting data acquisition on the car as it was emerging in other series. And he had no one else that had any experience, and I didn't have any experience, but I had some aptitude. And we figured out how to instrument an off-road car, how to measure. Those cars have tremendous wheel travel.
Yep.
And so measuring the spring deflection is actually quite tricky. It's very much a non-linear spring, and so we had to develop models and instrument to make sure that we were getting the car to fly was not easy.
Right.
The first time we built our new short track cars with coil springs, it pretty much landed on its nose off the first time it went off a jump, and it took a lot of time to really figure out how to get a car to fly.
Right. So that True Sport partnership, for those who don't or might not remember, True Sport was Jim Truman, and that was the car owner and team that Bobby Rahal won the Indy 500 in '86 in. He also was the owner of Mid Ohio when it first opened. So there's a very interesting lineage. So where did you go to college? Just curious.
So I went to Cal Poly Pomona.
Okay. And the reason I ask is when you went to Cal Poly Pomona, were you the only engineer, computer science major who didn't end up at JPL or somewhere in the aerospace industry? Because that was just a huge feeder program into aerospace. The engineers who were going into motorsports, most of them were coming out of Purdue, right?
Well, I don't know, because I was only on the West Coast and there was no internet there. And so I don't really know how it was happening elsewhere. Sure. I will say, though, that, my dad had worked at JPL for longer than I had been alive. And he was always trying to get me to go into the internship programs there. And I never really had any interest, much to his, frustration.
Sure.
And, but yeah, I was just, my brother had taken me to the California 500. And it was just very intriguing to me. And so working in racing, and the funny thing is that when we were developing the short course car PPI and trying to get that car to fly, we were testing essentially on some land in Diamond Bar, which was owned by the RC Aeros. It was semi-virgin land. It hadn't been developed yet. There was this little valley that was reasonably flat. And Frank Arcero Jr. basically, Cal and him made up some arrangement that they built a short course track essentially in this valley that was yet to be developed, right on the side of the 57 freeway. And it was kind of funny. We would go down there and test all the time. And I would show up at the test at like 8:00 and we start running. And then it's like, I got an 11:00 class. I got to go. And Diamond Bar was literally 15 minutes up the street from school. Yeah. And so I go to class and then be back by 1:00 or whatever.
Cool.
And then finish the rest of the test day.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Which was fun.
So from there, you ended up in Chicago, working for one of the legendary IndyCar teams, right?
Yeah, I did, but there was one stop in between.
Okay.
When I was working at PPI, basically there was a gentleman named Bob Sproul who had worked at Newman Haas, and he had wanted to leave Chicago in the cold. I think his wife was from California, and so he came to work for Cal, and he was a chief mechanic or the IndyCar chief mechanic of the year for 1986 for Newman Haas. And he came to work for us in 87, and he knew kind of where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. And he was really instrumental. He introduced me first to Peter Gibbons, who was in 1988, was the engineer for Craco Racing in Compton, California, back when they were based there.
Okay.
And Pete had reached out to me, like they were trying to redesign the Portland chicane, the festival chicane, because it was originally just a straight shot, and they were trying to basically reduce the speed of the cars going into turn one. And so he had hired me to basically write some software to figure out, given this corner shape, how fast is the car going to get into turn one. And so worked on that project for a while, and then he had tried to recruit me to come to Craco at the end of 88, and then he left for Penske. And so I was kind of like, well, what the hell?
Yeah.
You're recruiting me, but you're leaving. He tried to get me to go to Penske. That never really panned out. I don't think he ever had budget. But Craco was still interested. I met with Maury Cranes at his house in Beverly Hills. It was the weirdest interview ever. Barry Green was there and Maury Cranes, and I'm sitting there 22 years old, and had a good discussion with Maury, got a good offer, and graduated. I started in April. They were like, yeah, we'll pay you full time, immediately, go finish school. I realize you're going to be part-time until June. And so finished school. I graduated one weekend. The next weekend we went to Portland for the IndyCar race. And that's when they announced they were moving to Albuquerque. And I'm like, that's really not kind of the deal I signed up for.
Right.
And so I finished the year with Craco, but before the Laguna race, I had flown out to Chicago to meet with Ed Nathman at Newman Haas Racing. And it was clear that was a better opportunity than going to Dallas. And so I never really seen the outside of O'Hare Airport before I had kind of had that interview. I've flown through a million times, but didn't know anybody in Chicago. Had never really seen anything about Chicago, but accepted the job and was there in November of 89.
So Craco was Michael driving for them at that point still?
That was the year after the Michael divorce.
Okay.
And Ray Hall was driving essentially.
Oh, okay. And then when it became Gallus and went to Albuquerque, is that when Al Jr. was driving for them?
So Al Jr. was driving for Gallus, and then Ray Hall was driving for Craig, essentially.
Okay, cool.
And that's the way they ran in 90 after I had left.
Sure. So you get to Newman Haas, and we had a little chat before we came on, and you mentioned that, you basically, at that point in time, how big of a deal was data acquisition in IndyCar?
It was pretty prevalent at that point. The 89 cars didn't really have electronic dashes. They were still all analog.
Okay.
The test car in 89 had a very early version of some Pi hardware for data acquisition, but it was only on the test car. For 1990, Pi released the Pi System 4, which included the dash and the data logger as a remote unit. And that's where Ed Nathman really basically said, look, we need to invest in this. We need to hire, some kid in order to run it. That's essentially, he convinced Carl that he wanted to spend this much money to do this. And then for 1990, every car that we had 5 cars for, we had 4 cars, I think, on the ground, and then a test car as well.
Right.
That were all instrumented with Pi.
So we're going to talk about the Raspberry Pi later. Pi engineering is not the same.
Pi research and Raspberry Pi are two totally different
Exactly.
things.
That's what I was about to say. Is Pi engineering was, I think, the first data acquisition group out there, right? The first company that kind of did that.
Well, the computer power edge thing was probably the first one.
Okay.
And then Pi came in and it's typical like Apple computer. They take really good ideas and then do it better.
Right.
And so that's essentially what Pi was, and it was integrated into the ECUs for the Chevy Ilmore. So it was pretty nice package, and the software was reasonably good in order to do the analysis that we were capable of in those days.
Now, you may or may not know the answer to this. Was Formula One ahead or behind the game on this compared to IndyCar?
I think it was a little bit of ahead.
Okay.
I think Magneti Morelli
Yeah.
basically was leading the game at that point with the Ferraris, but I don't know how prevalent it was. Like Pi Research really wasn't in, it was maybe in the lower tier F1 teams.
Okay.
I think that most of the manufacturers had something more sophisticated by then.
Sure. So, I mean, today the opportunity is out there for, hundreds of data points. There's a whole, if you watch and pay attention to Formula One, all this data gets sent back to England, and there's a control room that looks like NASA of engineers monitoring all of the different stuff that every car does. I know IndyCar is not that sophisticated in their data acquisition, but compare, let's say, today to what you were working with in 1990.
The reality is when I left the IndyCar pit lane in 1997, the software that we used was, Pi Research version 6. And the AIM software that you use today, or at least when I started racing, was equally as capable as what was on the IndyCar pit lane. And we would pay tens of thousands of dollars for a license for that software, and AIM was giving it away for free. So, technology had advanced, the cost of things had changed. But I would say that, a basic AIM system and the software that comes with it is pretty much what we were using, on IndyCar pit lane in 1997 when I left.
Wow. So what was it like being on the front end of a whole industry? I mean,
it was interesting. As a team, we were trying to develop. My biggest job was basically trying to get accurate data.
Mm-hmm.
Finding sensors that would actually live in the environment. IndyCar is a pretty hostile environment. The vibration of an IndyCar, even when it's idling, is just unheard of. And I remember we were trying to develop some laser ride height sensors because we had a very pitch sensitive car, and so we wanted to get our heads around that. And we were using a vendor in Portland. And we came out to test in Portland, and because they were there, it was like this was a place where we should basically target getting these sensors on the car and making sure that they can live. And we told them about the vibration, and we needed to make sure that it's going to be what it's going to be subject to. We had accelerometers on the car and tell them what the vibration was, and they were like, yeah, we'll be fine, our sensors are great. And we put it on the car, and they see the car shaking at idle, and they're like, "Oh, this is not good." And we shook $4,000 sensors apart basically within a couple laps. And so it was really an era where we were mostly focused on trying to get accurate data out of the systems that we had, and then learning how to analyze it. What's happened now, like the state of the world now, is that the data comes out pretty accurately. Yes, there's inherent speed is always going to be inherently error because of tire growth or tire compression or GPS error or whatever, right? But like just getting things to be reliable and accurate as possible was a challenge back then.
I didn't even think about the idea of the computer collection of the data, what to do with it after you've got it. That at that point in time, you were not only writing those programs and working with the software, but just the capturing of the information to get to the software. That's something I hadn't even thought about. I figured that was the easy part of it.
Yeah, I mean, obviously recording analog signals and storing it as binary is fairly straightforward. It's the making sure that the analog signal going in is reasonable and reliable.
Right.
That's was tough then. That is primarily a solved problem now.
Yeah. Interesting. So you said you were there till 97. What did you do? Did you get out of motorsports at that point? What was your deal there?
So I was at Newman Haas through 94. I went to grad school. I took a year off to go to grad school. I then got a real job in downtown Chicago for a while, which was great. And then basically Cal Wells called me up 2 weeks before the 1995 IndyCar opener down in, was it Miami? I think that year.
Yeah, was that when they were doing Tamiami Park still?
No, I don't think it was Tamiami, but it was around the waterfront.
Okay.
To be honest with you, I don't really. It wasn't St. Petersburg. I know that.
All right.
But anyways, he called me and said, "Hey, I just got an IndyCar deal. Toyota's going IndyCar racing in 1996, and they've given me the green light to run a car in '95 and to run the Cosworth engine." And Hiro Matsushita basically was without a ride, but obviously had a sponsor and needed a team to get together. I just bought a '95 Reynard from Chip Ganassi, or leased it from Chip Ganassi. It was the car that flew. Actually, it's at Surfers Paradise the year before. I don't know if you ever saw that picture of Michael flying over the chicane in Surfers Paradise. Basically, Hiro drove that car in '96 or '95. And so the car showed up. It was in, a box of bits. He had hired a bunch of people to put it together and said, "Okay, we need you." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm kind of done." And then he said, "I helped you get to Krakow when you were leaving me." And it's like, it's 2 weeks before the season. I need someone with experience. And so I left the job in California, or in Chicago, and kind of told him I would work from Chicago because we're going to be traveling all summer anyway. And did that for '95. We traveled with 11 guys. It was great. We were a small team. We kind of overproduced, or
overachieved.
We were punching above our weight with Hiro, that's for sure. He was engaged with us. I think he was driving better than he had, and with other teams. And Gordon Kuppuck was our engineer, he was great to work with. And we just had a good time. It was 11, 12 guys traveling around the country, all in preparation for the Toyota engine that came in '96.
Yeah.
And so I was at PPI then, or RCR Wells, through '97.
Cool. And then you finally got out.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, and then, but the bug doesn't really. You can't really cure the bug, right?
Yeah.
And I was working for a company in Chicago that does they do the 1st and 10 line on football broadcasts.
Oh, cool.
And they do the NASCAR bubbles.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Back then. And so I was working for them, and I was actually working for a company that was merging with them. And our company was kind of in a holding pattern. We had really good leadership team, but we didn't really have much of a business. And the Sport Vision company that had done the broadcast enhancements had a really good products, but their VCs were upset with how they were bleeding money and not able to monetize any of it. And so the idea was to merge these two companies together, bring in the leadership, bring in the good product. And so they had kind of kept me, even though the merger was supposed to be done in 3 months. It ended up taking 9. So I was in a bit of a holding pattern with them for about 9 months, and not being terribly busy. And I had found a website where I was like, wow, there's Formula Fords for sale. Then they're not that expensive. And I'm thinking about could I get a Formula Ford? Could I drive a Formula Ford? And so I found one in Brian Graham in Barrie, Ontario, Canada. Was a Formula Ford prep shop. He had 3 DB6s he was selling. He had one that he had run and had converted to Formula Ford. He had one that was a roller that was intact but hadn't been converted, and then he had a box of parts that he said was a complete car. And so I bought the one that was the roller, brought it out to Chicago. I spent a year tearing it down to the frame and rebuilding it. I basically had no business financially owning a Formula Ford. I basically made my house payment. I made my 401k contributions, and then every single dollar I had went into the Formula Ford. And the reason why it took a year was because basically that was the rate that I could spend.
Sure.
I'm putting it together and getting it on the track.
Nice.
And what was really cool was, I didn't really know how to service the gearbox or rebuild the uprights or do any of that stuff. And what I found really rewarding was that most of the guys that I worked with at Newman Haas were like, yeah, bring your gearbox up here. We'll figure it out. And bring your upright up here. And, there's always a little bit of an antagonistic relationship with the guys on the shop floor and the engineers in the office. And I really wasn't sure how this was going to work out, but they were all they're all racers, right? They
Right.
all wish they could be driving, and they all wish that they were doing exactly what I was doing. And they were happy to see
Cool.
me doing what I was trying to do. And, Ray Sorensen he's currently the Black Dog racing team manager.
Okay.
The McLarens and formerly of the Chevy Corvettes and SRO. So yeah, he was my mechanic at driver school because I needed some help, and he came out for 3 days and helped me get my license.
Nice. So cool. Sitting here talking with Tim Weiss, who just laid out what I think a cool career. Traveling the country, traveling the world at that point in time, right? Because IndyCar was multinational at that point.
We went to Surfers Paradise. We went to Brazil.
Did you ever get to Motegi?
I left right before that, unfortunately. I really regret not going to Japan.
Yeah, that would have been cool. Now he's a club racer. He's got a job in the real tech world.
Yeah.
And but you were helping Brian Schubert, who's one of my buddies out here, with his with data off his Spec Racer Ford. And Brian says, "Got to get Tim on the show," and I'm like, "Okay, great, let's do it." And so we're here, and you laid out some stuff that you're doing before we started recording, and just some really cool stuff. Mentioned that what we have access to today at a relatively inexpensive price point is every bit of what they had in the 90s at IndyCar, which I think is really kind of cool. But you've taken it to a whole nother level through programming and writing some stuff and using a Raspberry Pi, which I just discovered about 6 months ago, that there was this thing, a Raspberry Pi. If anybody doesn't know what it is, Google it and check it out. It's really kind of a cool piece of open source stuff. And I actually use it to bring in video signals into my live broadcast, which is kind of cool.
Nice.
But you have a whole different application for the club racer. There's a couple of types of club racers out there. There's the club racers who are old school, who never had data acquisition and don't need it, or don't think they need it. And then you've got the younger kids who are all about the iRacing and all the data that comes off iRacing, and they're tech forward and all this kind of stuff. And I'm sure they want to just scoop up all the info they can. How easy is it for a club racer to, first of all, get data acquisition, and then how hard is it to actually learn what to do with that info when you've got it?
So I think that the products that are available right now are pretty close to plug and play. You can bolt them on, plug power to them, and plug them into your ODB2 connector or otherwise to your CAN network, and you can get a fair amount of information from just the car itself when you're racing, a production-based car, and even the modern open-wheel cars that are based on production engines. HPD. When they put the Honda Fit into Formula Ford, there was an ECU with a CAN stream there. And so you got throttle, you got, RPM, you got oil pressure, you got all these things essentially direct from the CAN stream. So, it's literally 4 connections plus a GPS connector. And you've got a pretty substantial data acquisition system. I would say that for club racing, what you really want to make sure you're measuring is everything that the driver touches. So throttle position for sure, brakes if you can, brake bias as well if possible, gear, which can be computed from speed and RPM, which already comes from the ECU, and then steering if possible too.
Sure.
But there's 3 approaches to trying to make a car go fast. There's using data to make the car go fast. One is to, develop the car, develop the driver, and then is the car actually performing and healthy? And in IndyCar, right, we were constantly measuring data to try to improve the car. It was very rarely we would kind of show Mario Andretti how to drive better using the data. But in club racing, it's very much the opposite, right? Where I'm not Mario Andretti, I'm a club racer. I'm, mid-grid at best. And there's seconds of time based in my driving. And so looking at everything the driver touches is really critical to analyzing and really understanding what you want the data to look like, and then how to manipulate the controls of the car to end up with that end result of data in the logs.
So I strikes me that you need two components to making the data useful. You need someone who knows how to read it, and then who can also tell you, who knows what you should be doing or what it should be saying to make you faster.
Correct.
And the other way to do it is to find someone who's faster, who has the same data, and then overlay it so you can put yours compared to theirs.
So I think that you can, when you overlay data, you can see where you're faster or slower from someone else. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can make the car do that yourself, right?
Right.
You need the right fundamental, like driving fundamentals. You want to have a brake pressure trace that has a particular shape. You want a throttle trace that has a particular shape, and kind of learning what that is. And usually, most of the driving coaching and things that you see out now is all about basically manipulating the car so you get the traces that are optimal.
Okay.
And so learning kind of what you want is good, and then learning the techniques of how to actually emulate that data on the outs, when it comes out, is really the critical skill for a club racer.
So if I'm a guy who's never touched a data acquisition stream and don't even know what I'm looking at, is there YouTube channels to go look at who can explain it to you, or you need to go find a coach? What's or both?
Both, right? But some of the things are really simple. Like you want to make sure that, at the end of the straight, the speed does not trail off.
Mm-hmm.
It actually has a good solid peak, and then, you're committed to the brakes. When you get on the brakes, you want to be hard on the brakes, but then in a threshold braking corner, you want to make sure that you're trailing off. And similarly, if you're turning in the steering wheel while you're putting on the throttle, it's likely going to understeer. And so kind of know where what you're inducing as a driver to make the car ill handling is really important. There's some good books out there. Chris Brown has written a fairly it's not lengthy. It's 140 pages. It's written by an engineer, but I don't think you need to be an engineer to read it and gain value from it. And he goes through most of this of what you're looking for, basically in your data.
So, you mean that I might be causing the car to handle poorly, and it's not the car's fault?
Yes.
I can't imagine that being the case. I thought I was a perfect race car driver. No, I'm just kidding. But it is, it does give you an opportunity when you think you're doing it right, because a lot of times we think we're doing it right and we're not. So this is kind of like almost definitive. Okay, you're not doing it right.
Yeah. No, and I would say that I spent 8 years driving my Formula Ford, kind of really not knowing the fundamentals, which was really kind of sad.
Right.
I had all this data, and I could look at it, and I could get overlays from other people and saying, yeah, I'm about the same speed in this corner, but why is my lap time still off? And I never really, again, I didn't have the experience from IndyCar racing of what the trusses were supposed to look like, because Mario always did it right? And so I always took that for granted, and I was always focusing on, like, why is the damper bottoming? Why is this happening? I was always focused on the car. And so really kind of changing my mind around using data to help develop the driver was a really critical learning that really helped, me in my pace. It became that, I became a much more safe driver. I was, I felt like I was always much more in control and much faster.
So what was that light bulb moment for you? When did you, what did you find that said, oh, okay, now this makes more sense?
So, racing in Formula Fords with the Kent engine, I learned that the carburetor is inherent traction control. And so driving a Formula Ford, you throw it into the corner and you mash the throttle and you just, you drive out, right? And the carburetor is essentially, limiting the spool up of the engine to get you out of the corner. When I put the Honda in with the EFI, it was very clear that the car, if I would just mash it too early, I would spin off into the inside of the corner. And I did that many times. And when I moved to Touring 4 in the NC, I've got the bent sheet metal to demonstrate that I wasn't doing it right. I was, a Miata must be a momentum car, so I need to get on the gas early. Well, actually, you don't, because it's better to be patient and get on the gas at the right time, and then get to full throttle early, not necessarily get to throttle early.
Got it. Got it. So that this is taking me down a different rabbit hole, but so the Kent is actually a easier car to drive because it's a carbureted car versus the
It's
EFI, right?
it's more forgiving for being bad on the throttle.
So yeah, it covers up your poor decision making,
Exactly.
and the Honda doesn't allow that.
No, it's got a very good response. When you put the throttle on, it's going to go.
You talked to me a little bit before the show about the system you've built, which is rather extensive. It sounds compared to what you would get in those plug and play systems. Can you fill us in a little bit about how all that came together?
Yeah. So AIM, I use an AIM dash on my car. It's connected to the ODB plug on the NC MX-5 that I race. AIM provides an ECU file to basically get the data out of it. I believe that Mazda wanted the pro teams to be able to get out of the NC back when that series was running. And what I found was that there's a couple of weak points on the engine or in the platform that I wanted to be able to monitor better or more of.
Right.
Specifically, like the MAF sensor is something that can fail, and it's kind of subtle. You just kind of start going slower when it's reading incorrectly.
That's the mass airflow sensor?
Yeah, the mass airflow sensor. And so that's not in the AIM standard file. AIM released a software update that allows you to create your own ECU file, but you've got to start from scratch. And so there was a community on the internet who had reverse engineered the NC platform. And so I created my own file that would basically take all the broadcast information out of the ECU. And then I took a Raspberry Pi and took some open source tools that Bosch had released in probably the 80s to basically connect to a CAN network using the C programming language and query the ECU. And so I built up a query schedule. I query for MAF, I query for injector pulse width. There's 70 some odd parameters that I'm now logging on the platform. And I would say about half of them are queried through the Raspberry Pi.
So how hard would it be for a guy who has no programming experience to kind of do some of this stuff?
So I would not go down the path I went, because doing it in C is very not approachable. You definitely need to know how to program and deal with that. Using Python is a little more approachable, for sure. And then I actually released a open source library called SwiftCanLib, which is interfaces basically to Swift programs. You can run Apple's Swift programming language on the Raspberry Pi. It actually runs quite well. Actually, usually when features are announced, they come out first on the Pi or on the Linux distributions, which is kind of funny because Apple it only releases once a year. And so Swift is a much more approachable language. My wife works with teaching sixth graders how to program in Swift, and they're very good at it. And so it's very approachable. It's a much easier language. It's much safer. It's very hard to do something wrong. And you can configure the Pi to basically, as soon as it gets power, it starts running these programs and it's hammering the ECU for more and more information. And then it's echoing it basically back out to the AIM so it can be logged.
So what you're telling me is if I don't want to be reminded how much smarter sixth graders are than I am, I should stay away from this project.
If I can do it, anybody can do it.
Says the guy who has a master's in computer science and engineering. That's good stuff. That's good stuff. So now, what are the additional parameters that you've been able to pull out of the ECU?
So definitely, the mass airflow,
right?
Map pressure, manifold pressure as well. Trying to think of all the different ones. There's long-term fuel trim, short-term fuel trim. There is.
And are you able to then go through and adjust those parameters also?
No, it's mostly trying to document where a problem may be occurring.
Okay.
Where the engine the mouth light on the dashboard basically says, hey, there's a problem,
Right.
but it gives you very little information. It'll tell you this sensor is bad.
Right.
But by logging that data over time, you can kind of actually see what's happening and really help diagnose the problem.
Oh, so you
It
could
is
see a
helpful.
math problem before it really becomes noticeable to your driving or to the car performance from just sitting in
Correct.
the car, so you could replace that math and not have to worry
Exactly.
about it. Because maths
Yeah.
really aren't fixable. You just pull it out and put a new one
Replace
in.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
So recording knock retard is good because sometimes if you've got bad gas and you're hitting all sorts of knock with the tune that you've got, you kind of want to resolve that pretty quickly.
Sure. Um, how much an advantage? You talked a lot earlier in the show about wanting the unfair advantage. How much of it? I'm not going to call it unfair because you're not cheating. Let's put it out there. We know that. But how much of an advantage do you think it is to have that info?
I think faster drivers are still going to win races.
Right.
However, the more information that you have will make sure that the driver has the tool in order to win the race, and the reliable tool to win the race, and hopefully being able to be in front of things and problems that are occurring so that they can be resolved quickly. I carry on the trailer every sensor that's on the engine. Mazda has a great grassroots motorsports program. The sensors are between $20 and $40 each for the most part. And so if I have a problem one session, I can determine what the actual problem is and then have another sensor on the car before the next session. And so for me as a mid-pack driver, track time is critical.
Sure.
And so not losing a weekend is helpful.
Right. And I assume that, by doing that also it is, you might not lose a weekend, but you're going to lose the performance for part of your weekend.
Yeah.
And, and then you'll be scratching your head as to why,
Yeah.
and even if it's a small amount of performance that you really can't figure out, maybe you'll start thinking that it's you that's doing it and it's not the car. So it just eliminates one set of variables.
Yeah, it just allows you to identify. It's expensive to take a car out and go run it at load,
Right.
To diagnose the problem, and so just having more information. That's primarily the value of the Raspberry Pi and being able to query all those OBD2 parameters, in that you just have more information to diagnose a problem. I don't know, knowing what my MAP sensor is doing is not very useful while I'm in the car.
Sure.
As long as it's working.
Sure.
But when it's not working, it's good to have all that information to resolve it in a timely manner.
Well, and we all know that once the check engine light comes on, a lot of times the damage is already done. And if this allows you to save money, because of course we're club racers, we don't have a lot of money, most of us. And if we could replace a sensor which prevents a bigger problem down the road, that's just another weekend to go racing.
Yep. Yeah, and like I said, knock retard is a critical bit. If you're constantly getting all sorts of knock retard down the front straight, there's something wrong, and you need to investigate, and you're going to save that piston.
Sure. So I don't need to hire a teenager who knows all this stuff. I can figure out a way with a little bit of effort to do it myself.
You can. It's probably more than a little bit of effort, but
right.
It can. There's also. Autosport Labs has some really interesting products as well that are not quite plug and play like AIM, but are more so than rolling your own Raspberry Pi for sure.
Sure. It's amazing because I've been doing this since '86, and our data acquisition in '86 was a stopwatch, and that's all we had. And I'm obviously in pro racing they were far more advanced, but I've watched the evolution of technology through professional racing and the trickle down to club racing, and the fact that we're able to untap what's coming off the motor anyway through OBD2 or whatever the case is. Now it's been there for years, but now that there's an opportunity to tap into it and get that data, it kind of strikes me as if your car is sorted, that's the next logical step to take things.
Yeah. And, the steering wheel sensor, I just use the OEM sensor. It's accurate. It's reliable. It's built for a 200,000 mile car.
Right.
and it's the Pi system. I'm sorry, the AIM system basically didn't have that data in its stream, and so I was able to capture it, and now I have basically that information. That's specifically a performance improving, driver performance improving signal.
So what other let's get away from the internals of the motor, which you've talked about. What other external like steering input, what else can you drag out of the AIM that's not there in a regular setup?
Trying to think of what, most OEM cars don't have oil pressure and oil temp. It's not critical to running the engine apparently, which is surprising.
Yeah.
And so making sure that you have those, making sure that fuel pressure, fuel consumed is also really important if you want to stop like pumping out your car and putting it back in, knowing what was actually used and kind of what the error of that reading is as well. Fuel flow is hard to measure, and so there's always going to be some error, but kind of what's usually the error is pretty consistent. And so for the set of injectors you have, and so kind of knowing what that error is and then computing how much fuel you're using makes life in the pack a little bit easier. Trying to think what else I use. Damper sensors are valuable, but at that point you're developing the car. You need an engineer to really interpret that data.
Are you able to pull brake pressure and all of that off of the AIM?
Yeah, so a brake pressure on my car comes directly from the ECU or the ABS module.
Right. Okay. So it's there if you can extract it out.
Exactly. The very first NC Miata I built, I had 4 pressure sensors on each because I knew there was ABS, and I'd never raced a car with ABS. And I wanted to know what I needed to do. And then I realized that the rear brakes are kind of just along for the ride and everything's in the front.
Right.
And it really wasn't necessary to monitor each channel independently. The ABS does not broadcast, and it doesn't really have an OBD2 interface to get that data itself. So put on 4 sensors, and it was expensive, but it was unnecessary because the aggregated brake pressure sensor from the ABS module that is broadcast is plenty sufficient for determining where the driver's doing the wrong things.
And does that come on the stock AIM package, or is that something you had to you get to extract off of it?
The funny thing is the reason why this all started was because AIM had it in their ECU file, but it didn't work. There was the values were always 0. And as I started sniffing what they were doing, I realized why it was wrong. And so then I was well down my path to getting it all myself anyway.
Is it fixed now?
I haven't heard. I haven't used their ECU file now in like 4 or 5 years.
Cool. Well, you've done a really good job of making me not feel like an idiot. Thank you. Sometimes these conversations, can go right over our heads, but to have someone who can speak club racer lingo and not, high level master's degree engineering lingo is really helpful. So I appreciate that. What other, you mentioned the book. We're going to put, I'm going to put a link to that book in the show notes. Okay. Any other resources that you can recommend people who want to learn more about this and get into it some more?
So there are the AIM webinars. They've been doing them through the pandemic, a little bit before the pandemic as well. They are lengthy, so they are a pretty significant time commitment. There's probably more efficient ways to kind of get the knowledge you need. The Chris Brown book, Squiggly Lines, is in the title. There's also an SAE book, which is much more dense and much more challenging to read, by Jorge Segers. That's all straightforward. I would also say that I use data in the car, not just from the car. I also try to bring timing and scoring information into the car, so I know what I need to be doing either during qualifying or a race, especially when I'm racing in alphabet soup groups. And the person I'm racing is maybe 3 cars ahead of me, and if they're actually going slower than me, I kind of want to know that if I can't see them. And so I use an app as well that basically uses an iPhone to display in a glanceable manner information that is happening about the race, with the the leader lap time, the car in front of me lap time, the car behind me lap time, and I find that very useful as well.
Cool. Tim Weiss, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking some time with us and getting here and giving us some of your knowledge. It's kind of a black magic kind of thing out there that I think all of us know it's there, and some of us have it, don't know how to use it. And anytime we can dig a little deeper into it and find out more, I think it's real helpful. So,
well, thanks for having me. It's been great to chat.
I should say one other thing here before we get to the end of the show. This show was not sponsored by AIM by any stretch. We didn't receive any money from AIM from doing it. But if you are listening, AIM, and you'd like to sponsor the show, the information on how to do that is in the show notes. And that goes for anybody who's listened to the show and would like to sponsor us. We would love to have any support that we can. The more we can earn to do this, the more we can go on the road and bring you some great coverage. So anyway, that said, that's going to do it for this episode of Inside the SCCA. If you'd like what you're hearing, subscribe to the Racing Wire podcast network so you won't miss an episode. It would also be great if you would leave a comment, especially if it's a good one. You can follow us on social media to find out who our next guest is and leave a question. On Twitter, it's @RacingWireNet. There's a new Inside the SCCA every week. I'm Brian Polanski. Have a fantastic weekend. Stay safe and go play with cars.
I'm Dorsey Schrader, and when I'm on my way to Embrace, I'll listen to the SCCA podcast, Inside the Short Bus.
The Inside the SCCA podcast is an independent media outlet owned, operated, and managed by Rule 15 Productions. Rule 15 Productions uses the SCCA name with permission, but without direction or influence from the Sports Car Club of America.